Donald Trump lost 2 debates to me in 2020. And since then, he hadn't shown up for debate. Now he's acting like he wants to debate me again. Well, make my day, pal. I'll even do it twice. So let's pick the dates, Donald. I hear you're free on Wednesdays.
Biden calls out Trump and the former president responded. More on that later. But first, voters yesterday hit the polls across 3 states to vote in Senate primaries that could shape who controls the upper chamber by the end of the year. And in Maryland's Democratic Senate primary, Prince George's County Executive Angela Alsobrooks defeated Congressman David Trone to face off against the state's former Republican governor, Larry Hogan. The contest between Alsobrooks and Trone was an expensive, nail-biting race for the open seat. Trone, millionaire owner of Total Wine, spent more than $61 million of his own money in the race, outspending Alsobrooks by nearly 10-1. Alsobrooks used her victory speech to rally voters, emphasizing the need to defeat Hogan in November. She is looking to become the state's first Black woman to represent the state in the Senate. Joining me now is the Hill's Niall Stanage, and my good friend. Good to see you, Niall.
Good to see you too, Julia.
Niall, we're going to start with that Maryland Senate race. I want to take a closer look at that. How important will this race be for Democrats who are looking to maintain their majority in the Senate? Alsobrooks certainly had a big win last night, but we know that Hogan has won statewide races in Maryland before.
He has, yes. As far as Hogan is concerned, for a Republican running in a Democratic-leaning state, that's probably as good as you're going to get electorally speaking. He does have some capacity to reach across the aisle in terms of the voters who he attracts. Having said that, one of the arguments for Ms. Alsobrooks was the fact that she can rally the Democratic base. She seems to have more appeal than David Trone did, particularly around Baltimore. So she stands a decent chance. Of course, the big picture, Julia, is that Democrats do, as you know, face an uphill battle to maintain their control of the Senate.
Absolutely. And I thought it was interesting last night in his victory speech, Larry Hogan talking about abortion and essentially saying he would protect a woman's right to get that procedure. Definitely paints a picture of the political landscape in Maryland. Wanted to move a little further west to West Virginia, where Republican Governor Jim Justice won that state's Republican Senate primary in the race for the seat held by retiring Senator Joe Manchin. Niall, it seems like Manchin essentially handed West Virginia in a way to Republicans because he's one of the last Democrats, if not the last Democrat, who's been able to win statewide in West Virginia. How will Senate control look if the Republicans retake the state? And do you think it's basically a certainty at this point that they will?
Well, to take the second part first, I think it is effectively a certainty. Obviously, Senator Manchin had a lot of internal critics on the Democratic Party, but he was capable of winning in a state that former President Trump was carrying by pretty massive margins. There's no real suggestion that any other Democrat in West Virginia can do that. So let's assume that that race is a gain for Republicans. Then the question is, can Democrats gain back anywhere else? In total, there are about 8 Senate seats where Democrats are at risk of defeat. So nothing's impossible in politics, but you have to say the odds pretty heavily favor Republican control of the Senate after the next election.
Absolutely. Republicans obviously very excited that Manchin decided to retire this cycle. I want to switch gears a bit to go up to New York. President Trump's former fixer, Michael Cohen, testified in Trump's hush money trial yesterday. What were the biggest takeaways from his testimony? It got pretty fiery at some points.
It did. I think one big takeaway was, to your point, the fact that cross-examination of Michael Cohen began on Tuesday. It will resume on Thursday when the court reconvenes. And that was pretty heated, as you might expect. Donald Trump's lawyers really going pretty hard at Cohen's credibility. And of course, they have quite a lot to work with. Michael Cohen is a convicted felon. He served jail time for a combination of tax evasion and campaign finance violations, as well as lying to Congress. Now, in relation to the other takeaways, I think one key one was he talked about meeting then President Trump in the Oval Office in early 2017. And the way he recounted that conversation suggested that the then president was very well aware of the way that Cohen was going to be reimbursed for the payment to Stormy Daniels. that puts Trump very centrally in this scheme, which prosecutors consider a corrupt and illegal scheme. Of course, we know the former president rejects that completely. His argument is the money paid to Michael Cohen was a valid legal expense.
So another interesting takeaway from yesterday is that Republican figures seem to be creating some sort of club outside of the courthouse, using the media attention, in New York right now in Lower Manhattan to speak out against the hush money case. Niall, do you think GOP figures, whether they're lawmakers or, governors, we saw Doug Burgum and Speaker Mike Johnson there yesterday, for example, are they using this platform to essentially win an endorsement, prove their loyalty to Trump in the future? And do you think this is really playing into the Veep stakes?
It definitely is. You have this really quite bizarre sort of VP idol thing going on outside of a criminal court, where there are lots of people. You mentioned Governor Burgum, Senator Tim Scott, others who have appeared, Vivek Ramaswamy on Tuesday, people who have been mentioned in the Veep stakes appearing for exactly the reason you say, Julia, to sort of prove their loyalty to former President Trump. I think that is something that Republicans writ large are very eager to do for their own purposes. I mean, no one thinks, for example, that Speaker Johnson is going to become Trump's running mate, but he showed up on Tuesday to offer his support to endorse Trump's thesis that this is all a sort of politicized effort to hobble him in the election. But clearly there are people who are kind of dashing to New York to make sure that they don't fall behind in the Veep stakes.
It's hard not to look at that picture. What was it of Burgum, Corey Mills from Florida, Byron Donalds, Speaker Johnson? They were all matching in those red ties and navy suits. I thought that was a little interesting takeaway from that effort that seems to be coordinated. We'll see. Niall,
I think Donald Trump's dominance of the Republican Party is reflected in increased sales of red ties at this stage. But
I think so. They're wearing the party's colors. So there we go. While GOP strategists really have no clue. I mean, none of us have no clue who Trump will ultimately pick to be his running mate. We know that there's been a lot of speculation around Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott. I know that North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum really seems to be the flavor of the week in terms of sources I've spoke with, recently. Who else is on that short list? And do you think their support throughout the trial, or whoever's going to New York to support Trump, will that be dependent on who he picks?
Well, I think in terms of the shortlist itself, there are a couple of women on this shortlist.
Yeah.
Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the governor of Arkansas, for example, is one possibility in that respect. The other possibility that's often mentioned is Elise Stefanik from New York. So they're definitely on the shortlist. More broadly speaking, Julia, I think that your point about the uncertainty around this is a really important one. Because if we were, having this conversation, 2 weeks ago, we'd probably have mentioned Kristi Noem.
Yes.
And she just blew herself up with that pretty catastrophic run of media interviews. So I think that is a real reminder of just how unpredictable this is.
Absolutely, very unpredictable, and a PR lesson, really, to a lot of potential candidates or candidates running. I want to switch gears and go to Capitol Hill. House Democrats have their eyes on Trump, obviously. They're probing the former president's comments in which he asked for $1 billion in campaign cash from major oil companies. What was Trump offering in return? And while this necessarily maybe wasn't illegal, I know there's some debate about that, could this harm his chances in 2024?
So broadly, what he was offering was deregulation, or at least a loosening of regulation around that industry. He also seemed to be suggesting that he would crimp or at least reduce the incentives for the purchase of electric vehicles. Now, Democrats are arguing that that's a quid pro quo and is therefore corrupt. I'm not sure that argument is really going to carry the day for two reasons. One is, it is, as you know, Julia, a very long tradition of politicians suggesting that if certain industries or certain groups vote for them, they will get policies that they favor. Like, that is not particularly surprising. And then you layer on top of that the fact that this is Donald Trump we're talking about. I mean, I don't think anyone at this point detractor or supporter of Trump's is really surprised that he is prone to viewing things in a kind of transactional way. So I get why Democrats are doing this, to suggest the appearance of corruption. But, frankly, when Donald Trump and corruption come together, I think most voters have already made up their minds one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a love him or hate him sort of situation. Turning to a bit of a darker story, we know that right now Israel is continuing to launch its offensive on Rafah. And President Biden has definitely, arguably been putting out some pretty mixed messages on U.S. support for Israel or U.S. support for Palestinian civilians. But House Republicans are looking to reverse President Biden's recent freeze on high-load weapons to Israel. We know that that proposal is likely dead on arrival because Democrats control the Senate, but are Republicans essentially looking to take advantage of this divide among Democrats on the issue of U.S. support for Israel?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that. One could talk for days about the rights and wrongs of Biden's policy toward Israel on Gaza, but the politics of this from an electoral standpoint are really quite stark in that Republican voters are, by and large, overwhelmingly supportive of Israel. And Democratic voters are, it's not even quite right to say split up the middle. In fact, most polling shows that most Democrats, in terms of voters, are more sympathetic toward the Palestinians than the Israelis at this stage. That creates this massive schism in the Democratic Party. So we have people, whether it's Bernie Sanders or AOC or Ilhan Omar, arguing for a very Israel-critical position. And then we have much, much more pro-Israel Democrats. And from a political standpoint, Republicans are clearly trying to capitalize on that division.
Yeah, I could definitely see that potentially playing in Michigan, where there's a large Arab American vote that could play a major deciding role in this election. Niall, finally, we got some breaking news before we sat down to chat. President Biden earlier today, challenged Trump to debates, I believe, in June and September, and the former president appears to have accepted. Look, this is a long time coming, and we know that these two in 2020, they debated, one or two times, and then then the third debate didn't happen. So do you think we'll ultimately see these two go head to head?
I tend to think we will, actually. To me, the most interesting thing here is President Biden's enthusiasm to debate. It is traditional in politics that it is the candidate who is more worried about the election's outcome, who is keener to debate to change the trajectory of the race. And so I think it's quite revealing in a way that President Biden does want to have these debates. Now, having said that, I do not expect former President Trump to back away from this. Clearly, he did do so in the Republican primaries, but he could cast that as, well, I'm not sort of wasting my time with these minnows. In a presidential race, you can't really make that argument. And frankly, I think that Trump will probably welcome the opportunity to debate with Biden. And that is the early indication we're seeing in terms of his response to this offer.
I want to say that this is going to be must-see television, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of voters who look at this matchup and sort of say they're not very happy with it, or there's not a lot of enthusiasm about it, but we will see. Niall Stanage, thank you so much, as always, for your wisdom and your expertise on these topics.
Great to talk to you, Julia. Take care.
Thank you. The two drugs used to induce a medicated abortion could soon be illegal without a prescription in Louisiana. A last-minute amendment would classify the drugs as a controlled substance, similar to highly addictive drugs like opioids and Deferin and antidepressants. Should the law pass, it would be illegal to possess the drug without a prescription in the state, and a violation could mean up to 5 years in prison. It's the latest effort from the state's GOP-led legislature to control access to the drug. Louisiana has already banned surgical and medical abortions except to save a patient's life. Last week, lawmakers rejected a bill that would have added exceptions for cases of rape or incest. The final vote on the amended bill will be before June 3rd. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem is under fire once again as a seventh Native American tribe in her state banned her from its reservation. Those bans come after she commented earlier this year that tribal leaders benefited from drug cartels. Last week, Noem doubled down on her comments, urging tribes to support her law enforcement initiatives. The vote means just 2 of her state's 9 reservations have not banned her. Noem has been floated as a potential running mate for former President Trump. Breaking news Wednesday as Jimmy Carter's grandson says the former president's time is coming to an end. Carter, who is now 99 years old, has spent more than a year in hospice care. His wife, former First Lady Rosalynn Carter, passed away last November at the age of 96. The former president's grandson, Jason Carter, spoke on the last time he saw his grandfather, saying several weeks ago they watched a Braves baseball game, and when discussing his well-being, Jimmy Carter said, "I don't know myself." Carter served as the 39th president of the United States from 1977 to 1981, working for people across the world after his presidency. He was awarded the 2002 Nobel Peace Prize for working to find peaceful solutions to international conflicts. He also worked tirelessly to advance democracy and human rights. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.